There are nights when the mind wanders backward, not through years or centuries, but through ages so distant they exist only as whispers beneath the surface of what we think we know. On such nights, you might find yourself thinking about stone-cold, patient stone that has outlasted empires, languages, entire ways of seeing the world. And carved into some of that stone, pressed into clay cylinders smaller than your hand, are images that have troubled scholars and dreamers alike for more than a century. They show figures, tall figures, winged figures, figures that stand above smaller human forms in postures that suggest authority, instruction, or something else entirely, something we no longer have words for. The ancient Sumerians, who pressed these images into wet clay 5,000 years ago, left no explanations written beside them, no captions, no clarifications. Only the images themselves, silent and unyielding, waiting in museum darkness. What if those images were not myths, invented by primitive minds trying to explain thunder and harvest? What if they were memories fragmented, reshaped, passed down through so many generations that the original meaning had worn away like footsteps on ancient stairs? What if the Sumerians themselves were remembering something they had not witnessed, something their ancestors had witnessed, or their ancestors before them, in ages so distant that even the landscape of the world was different? This is not a story about gods, not in the way we typically use that word. This is a story about memory, how it bends, how it breaks, how it transforms over vast stretches of time. It is about what might remain when the truth is forgotten but the echo persists. And it is about a war that may never have been a war at all, not as we understand such things, but which was remembered as one because human language had no other frame through which to interpret what had been seen. The Anunnaki. The name itself has been carried through millennia, translated and retranslated, whispered in academic halls and conspiracy forums alike until its original meaning has become nearly impossible to discern. In Sumerian tradition, they were described as those who came from heaven to earth, but even this translation is uncertain. The cuneiform symbols can be read in different ways. The meanings shift depending on context, on which city-state produced the tablet, on which period of Sumerian history the text emerged from. What remains consistent, however, are the images. In cylinder seal after cylinder seal, we see them. Tall figures, often with wings or elaborate headdresses, standing among humans who appear smaller, more numerous, more fragile. Sometimes these tall figures hold staffs or strange objects. Sometimes they are positioned near symbols that suggest celestial bodies, stars, the sun, the moon, rendered in geometric simplicity. And sometimes, in the margins of these tiny carved scenes, there are suggestions of conflict. Not the grand battlefield epics we associate with war. Not armies clashing with swords and chariots, though those images exist in later Sumerian and Akkadian art. These earlier images are stranger, more ambiguous. Two tall figures facing each other in postures that might suggest confrontation or might suggest ritual. Symbols arranged in patterns that could represent violence or could represent something we have no cultural context to interpret. Buildings or structures shown in states that might be destruction or might be transformation. Perhaps what was remembered in these stones was not a war in any conventional sense. Perhaps what was being preserved, imperfectly and incompletely, was the memory of a division, a separation, a breaking of something that had once been whole. Consider how stories change as they pass through generations. A grandmother tells her granddaughter about a time of great upheaval. The granddaughter, years later, tells her own children, but the details have shifted. Dates become vague, motivations become simplified. Complex political realities reduced to simple conflicts between good and evil, between this side and that side. Now, extend that process not across 3 generations, but across 300, across 3,000, across so many generations that the very language used to tell the story has evolved into something unrecognizable. What remains after such transformation is not fact. It is impression. The emotional residue of something that mattered deeply. The sense that something changed, that there was a before and an after, that what came after was somehow diminished, somehow less than what had been before. The Sumerian tablets speak of a time when the Anunnaki walked among humans. They describe these beings as teachers, as those who brought knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, the movements of stars. But they also describe conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, disputes over authority, over territory, over the proper relationship with humanity. These are not the conflicts of myth alone. They have the texture of remembered history, of stories passed down because they explain something important about the world people found themselves inhabiting. But here is where the mystery deepens. If these were simply stories invented to explain natural phenomena, why the seasons change, why rivers flood, why some years bring abundance and others bring famine, why do they contain such specific details? Why do the cylinder seals show the same figures across different cities, different time periods, different artistic styles? Why does the iconography remain so consistent even as the political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted and fractured? It may be that what was being remembered was not the literal events themselves, but the imprint those events left on early human consciousness. A collective memory, carried forward not in words but in images, in symbols, in the recurring motif of tall figures who once stood among shorter ones and then, at some point lost to time, withdrew. The war, if we can call it that, was not remembered as a human war. It was remembered as something that happened among those who came before, those who were other, those whom the Sumerians could only describe using the language of divinity, because no other language existed to capture what they were trying to say. And the outcome of this conflict was remembered not as victory or defeat, but as absence, as departure, as the slow fading of something that had once been close and present and real. When you look at those cylinder seals now, in the controlled lighting of museums, you are looking at an attempt to preserve something that was already ancient when the seals were made. The Sumerian scribes were not recording contemporary events. They were copying, interpreting, trying to maintain connection with a past that was slipping away even as they worked. Each carving was an act of remembrance, an insistence that something had happened, that it mattered, that it should not be forgotten. But memory is not preservation. Memory is transformation. And what these stones may preserve is not the war itself, but how that war was understood by people standing thousands of years after it occurred, people who had inherited fragments of a story they could not fully comprehend, but could not fully dismiss. The clay tablets that survive from ancient Sumer are fragmentary. Most are broken, their edges crumbled, their surfaces worn by time and handling and the simple passage of millennia. Archaeologists piece them together like puzzles with missing pieces, trying to reconstruct narratives from shards. And what emerges from this painstaking work is not clarity, but deeper ambiguity, stories that seem to point towards something specific but never quite arrive at definitive meaning. There is a text, recovered from the ruins of Nippur, that describes a council. The language is formal, ritualistic, the kind of language used for matters of grave importance. The Anunnaki are gathered. Decisions must be made, but the text does not explain what decisions, or why they matter, or what consequences follow from them. It assumes the reader already knows. It assumes a shared context that has been lost to us completely. This is the challenge of trying to understand what was remembered. We are reading texts written for an audience that possess knowledge we do not have, that took for granted information we can only guess at. We are looking at images carved for people who understood their symbolic language intuitively, the way you understand a stop sign without needing to sound out the letters. And we are trying, across a gulf of 5,000 years, to reconstruct not just what was shown, but what it meant. Perhaps the war that was remembered differently was not a war of weapons and bloodshed. Perhaps it was a war of philosophy, of vision, of fundamental disagreement about the path forward. Ancient texts hint at divisions among the Anunnaki, some who favored continued involvement with humanity, others who believed the time had come for withdrawal, some who saw humans as children requiring guidance, others who saw them as creations that had matured beyond the need for intervention. These are not the conflicts of primitive mythology. These are sophisticated ethical questions, the kind that still occupy human thought in different forms. What is the responsibility of the powerful toward the vulnerable? When does guidance become control? When does teaching become interference? At what point must the teacher step back and allow the student to make their own mistakes, even knowing those mistakes will cause suffering? If such questions trouble the Anunnaki, if beings of greater knowledge and longer perspective than humans possessed struggled with these dilemmas, then perhaps what was remembered as war was actually the painful process of separation. The ending of an age when humanity had walked alongside those who remembered older truths, older ways. The beginning of an age when humans would have to find their own path through darkness, carrying only fragments of what they had been taught. The cylinder seals show departure. Not in every image, not explicitly, but in the patterns that emerge when you study many seals together. Early seals show the tall figures present, active, engaged with human affairs. They are shown instructing, guiding, participating in rituals and ceremonies. Later, seals show them more distant, more abstract. They become stylized, symbolic, rather than representational. And in the latest Sumerian seals, they begin to disappear entirely, replaced by human kings who wear the symbols of divine authority, but who are themselves clearly mortal, clearly human. This progression suggests a transition, a handing over of responsibility. And perhaps this transition was not peaceful. Perhaps there were those among the Anunnaki who resisted it, who believed humanity was not ready, who feared what would happen when the guidance was withdrawn. Perhaps there were those among humans who fought to maintain the connection, who built temples and performed rituals in desperate hope of calling back those who had departed. The war remembered in Sumerian stone might have been this, the conflict between holding on and letting go, between a past that offered certainty and a future that demanded independence. Not armies clashing in fields, but a slower, quieter kind of violence. The violence of necessary change, of bridges being burned, of doors being closed that could not be reopened. There are texts that describe a great flood, a destruction that swept away the old world and everything in it. Nearly every ancient culture has some version of this story. The details change. Sometimes it is divine punishment, sometimes it is natural catastrophe, sometimes it is both, but the core remains consistent. Something ended. The world that had been was destroyed, and what came after was fundamentally different. What if this too was a memory, distorted by time but rooted in something real? Not necessarily a literal global flood, though geological evidence suggests many catastrophic flooding events in humanity's deep past. But perhaps a metaphorical flood, the overwhelming sense of rupture, of discontinuity, of being severed from a previous age. The feeling that accompanies any profound ending, when the familiar world gives way to something unknown and frightening. The Anunnaki, in these flood narratives, are divided. Some argue for preservation, for saving humanity from destruction. Others counsel non-interference, insisting that what must end should be allowed to end. This too sounds like the echo of a deeper conflict, a war fought not with weapons but with words and choices and the wielding of power in ways both visible and invisible. And when the flood recedes in these stories, the Anunnaki are changed. They are fewer in number. They are more remote. The age of direct contact has ended. Humanity is left to rebuild alone, carrying only scattered memories of what had been before, only fragmentary knowledge of the teachings they had received. Perhaps this is what the Sumerian stones remember, not a war of conquest or domination, but a war of ending, the painful severing of ties that had bound two different forms of consciousness together. The Anunnaki withdrawing, whether by choice or necessity, and humanity left to inherit an earth that suddenly felt larger and lonelier than it had before. The megalithic structures that dot the ancient world, the massive stone temples, the precisely aligned monuments, the constructions that seem to exceed the technological capabilities we attribute to their builders. These too might be memories carved in stone, not built by the Anunnaki themselves, perhaps, but built by humans who still remembered what they had been taught, who still possessed fragments of knowledge from an earlier age. And then, as generations passed, as the memories faded, even the ability to build such structures was lost. This is how endings happen in reality. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually. The light dims slowly. Skills are forgotten bit by bit. Each generation preserves a little less than the one before, until finally only the stones remain massive, inexplicable, testifying to a capability that has been lost. The war, then, might have been time itself, the inevitable wearing away of connection, the natural entropy that affects all things, even memories of gods. The Anunnaki did not lose a battle. They simply faded, as all things fade, as even mountains erode given enough centuries. And what was remembered in Sumerian stone was humanity's attempt to hold on to something that could not be held, to preserve in clay and carving what was slipping away like water through cupped hands. When the Sumerian scribes pressed their styluses into wet tablets, when they carved images into small cylinders of stone that would be rolled across clay to create repeating patterns, they were performing an act of defiance against forgetting. They were saying, "This happened. This mattered. Even if we no longer fully understand it, even if the meanings have become obscure, it must not be completely lost." And so the images remain, silent witnesses to something that may have been catastrophic division or quiet departure, violent upheaval or natural conclusion. The stone does not explain itself. It only shows tall figures and short figures, symbols of sky and earth, patterns that suggest relationship and then separation. The war was remembered differently because there was no single war to remember. There were countless smaller endings, countless moments of severance, countless instances of farewell stretched across centuries or millennia. And all of these endings collapsed together in cultural memory, compressed into stories of conflict among gods, of divisions in heaven that echoed down to earth. In the British Museum, there is a cylinder seal no larger than a child's thumb. It dates to approximately 2300 BCE, carved during the Akkadian period, when Sumer's city-states had been unified under a single empire. The seal shows 7 figures arranged in a specific pattern, 2 tall figures flanking a central tree or pillar, with smaller human figures positioned below and to the sides. Above them, carved with careful precision, are 7 dots, arranged in a way that suggests stars or celestial markers. You can hold this seal in your hand, feel its weight, run your fingers over grooves cut more than 4,000 years ago, and you can wonder, what did the person who carved this know? What were they trying to preserve? Were they copying an older image, already ancient to them? Or were they interpreting something from oral tradition, trying to give form to stories that had been passed down through generations without ever being written or carved before? The 7 figures appear again and again in Mesopotamian iconography. 7 Anunnaki, 7 judges, 7 sages who brought knowledge before the flood. The number itself seems significant, woven through Sumerian and Babylonian texts with a consistency that suggests meaning beyond simple repetition. But what that meaning was, what the number 7 represented to the people who used it so deliberately, remains unclear. Perhaps it was literal 7 specific beings remembered by name and role. Or perhaps it was symbolic, a way of saying the important ones, the council, those who made decisions that affected everything that followed. Numbers in ancient texts often carry symbolic weight that transcends mere counting. They are used to indicate completeness, hierarchy, sacred arrangement. 7 might simply mean the ones who mattered most. But the seals suggest more than symbolism. They show individuation. The figures are not identical. They wear different headgear, hold different implements, stand in different postures. Someone carved these distinctions deliberately. Someone believed the differences were important enough to preserve in stone. If there was division among the Anunnaki, if what was remembered as war was actually fracture within a unified group, then these 7 might represent the factions, the perspectives, the different visions of how things should proceed. And the conflict might have been this: not all 7 agreed. Not all 7 wanted the same future for humanity or for themselves. There is a text fragment from Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Sumer, that describes a decision being made in heaven. The language is formal, almost bureaucratic. A matter is brought before the council. Arguments are presented. A judgment is rendered. But the text breaks off before revealing what the matter was, or what judgment was passed. We have only the form of the proceeding, not its content, like finding the minutes of a crucial meeting with all the substantive discussion redacted. What kind of matter would require formal counsel among beings remembered as gods? What decisions were weighty enough to demand this kind of deliberative process? The texts hint at possibilities, the fate of humanity after some transgression, the proper boundaries of divine involvement in mortal affairs, the question of what knowledge should be shared and what should be withheld. These are not the concerns of myth. These are the concerns of governance, of ethics, of beings trying to navigate complex responsibilities in a situation where there were no clear precedents to follow. And if such deliberations occurred, if the Anunnaki truly grappled with these questions, then disagreement seems inevitable. Different perspectives would yield different conclusions. Different values would suggest different courses of action. The war might have been this disagreement made manifest. Not violence necessarily, but opposition, unbridgeable differences that eventually forced separation. Some choosing one path, others choosing another. and the fracture widening until what had been unified became irreparably divided. In later Babylonian mythology, we see echoes of this division solidified into narrative: Tiamat and Marduk, the old order and the new, chaos and structure. These stories, written down more than 1,000 years after the earliest Sumerian texts, may preserve the memory of that ancient division in mythologized form. The war between generations of gods, between different philosophies of how reality should be ordered, between those who represented what had been and those who represented what would come next. But before these myths were codified, before they took on the elaborate narrative form we find in texts like the Enuma Elish, there were the seals, simple images, tall figures in positions of tension, symbols arranged in ways that suggest confrontation or separation. And these images predate the elaborate mythologies by centuries, perhaps by millennia. What this suggests is that the story existed before it was fully narrativized. The memory of division, of conflict, of some crucial breaking point was present in the culture long before anyone wrote out the detailed epic of warring gods. The seals preserve the older memory vigor, less narratively satisfying, but perhaps closer to whatever truth was being remembered. Consider what happens when a culture tries to remember something it no longer fully understands. The human mind craves narrative. It wants beginning, middle, end. It wants motivation, conflict, resolution. So when faced with fragmentary memories, images without context, stories without conclusions, the mind works to fill in the gaps. It creates connections. It imposes structure. It transforms ambiguous evidence into coherent narrative. The elaborate Babylonian myths of divine warfare might represent this process. The original memory, something broke, something changed. There was division among those who had been unified, gets elaborated over generations until it becomes a full epic with heroes and villains, battles and victories. Cosmic implications spelled out in explicit detail. But the seals remain, and they tell a simpler, stranger story. They show separation without explaining it. They show tension without resolving it. They preserve the emotional content of the memory, the sense that something fractured, without providing the narrative satisfaction of understanding why or how. Perhaps this is closer to truth than the later myths. Perhaps what actually happened was less comprehensible than the stories that grew up around it. Perhaps the Anunnaki divided for reasons that humans, even those who witnessed it, could not fully grasp. And so the memory that was passed down was not of the reasons, but of the result. Beings who had been present became absent. Unity became division. An age of close connection gave way to an age of distance and silence. The departure is remembered in countless texts. The gods withdrew. They ascended. They returned to heaven. The language varies, but the theme remains constant. There was a time of presence, and then that time ended. And between the presence and the absence, there was conflict. Not necessarily physical violence, but something disruptive enough, significant enough, that it marked the boundary between ages. This is the war that was remembered differently. Not a war with victors and vanquished, not a war that could be depicted in the heroic terms of human warfare, but something stranger and more final, the war that ended intimacy, that established the distance between human and divine that would characterize all subsequent ages. In the ancient city of Uruk, archaeologists have found layer upon layer of temples, each built atop the ruins of the previous one. The lowest layers date to before written history, to a time when the Sumerians had not yet developed cuneiform, when their only records were the images they carved and the structures they built. These earliest temples are massive, ambitious, suggesting a civilization at its height, but they were abandoned. New temples were built on top of them, different in design, smaller in scale, as if something had changed in how the divine was approached or understood. Perhaps this, too, is evidence of the remembered war. The older temples built when contact was close, when the Anunnaki walked among humans and were worshipped with confidence and familiarity. The newer temples built after the withdrawal, when the divine had become remote and required different forms of approach, different architectures of prayer and sacrifice. The shift from presence to absence, from intimacy to distance, this might be what was preserved in stone and clay. Not the specific events of any conflict, but the transformation those events produced. The before and after. The memory that things had been different once, and something had happened to change them irrevocably. There are traditions, carried through Sumerian literature and into later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, of knowledge that was deliberately hidden, secrets written down and buried beneath temple foundations, teachings inscribed on tablets and sealed in clay jars, placed in locations known only to initiates. The reasons given for this concealment vary. Sometimes it is to protect sacred knowledge from profane eyes. Sometimes it is to preserve it through coming catastrophe. Sometimes the texts simply state that certain things were hidden without explaining why. But there is another possibility, one that the fragmentary nature of the texts themselves suggests. Perhaps what was hidden was not complete knowledge, but the remnants of knowledge that had already been partially lost. Perhaps after the division, after the Anunnaki withdrew, humanity found itself in possession of fragments, teachings, half-remembered, techniques incompletely understood, wisdom that had been given but not fully absorbed. And these fragments were buried not to conceal them, but to preserve them, in the hope that someday their full meaning might be recovered, or that those who had departed might return to complete what had been left unfinished. The texts speak of the Abzu, the deep underground waters where Enki, one of the chief Anunnaki, was said to dwell. This was described as a place of wisdom, where the secrets of creation and craft were kept. But the description is strange. It is beneath the earth, yet also described in terms that suggest it might be somewhere else entirely, accessible through the deep waters, but not simply located there. The language wavers between literal geography and metaphor, as if the writers themselves were uncertain how to describe what they were trying to convey. Perhaps the Abzu was a memory of something that existed before the division, a shared space, a repository of knowledge, accessible when the Anunnaki were present, but sealed or lost when they withdrew. And the rituals performed to access it, the ceremonies conducted at temples built above underground springs, were attempts to reopen what had been closed, to re-establish connection with sources of wisdom that had been cut off. The war remembered in stone might include this severance. Not just the departure of beings, but the closing of access to knowledge, to perspective, to ways of understanding that humans had briefly touched but never fully possessed. The violence of being denied something you had begun to rely upon. The trauma of doors closing that you had thought would always remain open. In archaeological sites across Mesopotamia, there are structures whose purpose remains obscure. Buildings that don't fit the patterns of temples or palaces, of granaries or workshops. Rooms arranged in configurations that suggest ritual use, but of a kind we no longer recognize. Chambers aligned to celestial events with a precision that implies sophisticated astronomical knowledge, yet built in periods we consider primitive or early in the development of civilization. These structures might be attempts to remember, to reconstruct from fragmentary understanding the forms and practices of an earlier age. If the Anunnaki had taught certain ways of marking time, of aligning human activity with celestial movements, of conducting ceremonies that acknowledged the relationship between earth and sky. Then, after their departure, humans might have continued these practices even as the full understanding of why they mattered gradually faded. This is how sacred tradition often works. The forms persist long after the reasons for them have been forgotten. Prayers are repeated in languages no longer spoken, rituals performed whose original meaning has been lost, structures maintained and rebuilt because they have always been maintained and rebuilt. Because to stop would be to sever the last thread, connecting present to past. The cylinders' seals from later periods show this deterioration. The images become more stylized, more abstract. The tall figures are less individuated, more generic. Sometimes they merge with or become indistinguishable from human rulers who claim divine authority. The iconography that had been specific and varied becomes standardized, formulaic. This is not the work of cultures moving forward into greater sophistication. It is the work of cultures trying to preserve something they no longer fully understand, copying forms without grasping their original significance. But even in this copying, in this faithful reproduction of images whose meaning had become obscure, there is a kind of remembering, an insistence that something important happened, that these images matter, that they must be passed on even if their full significance can no longer be articulated. The war might have been fought on this front too, the battle against forgetting, against the natural entropy that erodes all memory over time. Those who tried to preserve what had been taught, who inscribed tablets and carved seals and built temples according to half-remembered principles, were fighting their own war. Not against enemies, but against the slow dissolution of knowledge, against the inevitable fading of all things into obscurity. There is a genre of Sumerian literature called the lamentation. These are texts that mourn the destruction of cities, the abandonment of temples, the silence of gods who once spoke. They are written in a particular meter, with repetitive structures that suggest they were meant to be chanted or sung. And they are filled with a profound sense of loss, not just of physical destruction, but of spiritual abandonment, of being left alone in a world that had once been attended by presences greater than human. These lamentations might preserve the emotional aftermath of the remembered war. The grief of severance, the confusion of being suddenly alone after a long period of guidance, the fear that whatever had provided meaning and structure to existence had withdrawn permanently, leaving only ruins and silence. One lamentation describes the goddess Inanna associated with Venus, with love, with the crossing of boundaries fleeing her city as it falls to invaders. But the language used is strange. She is described as leaving, but also as being driven out, as abandoning her people, but also as being forced to abandon them. The text cannot quite decide whether her departure was choice or compulsion, whether she left willingly or was compelled by circumstances beyond her control. This ambiguity might reflect genuine uncertainty in the cultural memory. When the Anunnaki withdrew, was it because they chose to? Because humanity had developed sufficiently to no longer need their presence? Or was it because they had to, because something had happened that made their continued presence impossible? The texts waver between these interpretations, suggesting that even in ancient Sumer, even much closer to whatever events were being remembered, the truth was already unclear. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the division among the Anunnaki was partly about this very question, some believing the time had come for withdrawal, others believing continued presence was necessary, and the conflict arising from this fundamental disagreement about responsibility and timing, and the resolution, whatever form it took, resulted in departure, all of them leaving, even those who wished to stay, because the division itself had made continued presence untenable. The stone records this departure in various forms: seals that show processions moving upward towards symbols of heaven, reliefs that depict empty thrones, abandoned temples, images of humans reaching upward toward empty sky, their postures suggesting supplication or desperation. These are not images of victorious gods departing after conquest. They are images of absence, of void, of something missing that had once been present. And carved into many of these stones are symbols that might represent the war itself. Not weapons or armies, but signs of fracture, broken tablets, divided seals, images split by deliberate lines as if to show something that had been whole becoming separate. The violence recorded is not physical but existential, the violence of unity becoming multiplicity, of presence becoming absence, of certainty becoming confusion. The Sumerian king lists those strange documents that claim to record rulers going back to before the flood, speak of kingship descending from heaven after the waters receded. Before the flood, the reigns of kings are measured in impossibly long periods, thousands of years, tens of thousands. After the flood, the reigns become more plausible, more human in scale. This shift is usually interpreted as mythology giving way to history, but perhaps it records something else: the transition from an age when those who governed had longer perspectives, longer lifespans, fundamentally different relationships to time, to an age when leadership became purely human, limited by human mortality and human understanding. The flood, then, might be the war. Or rather, the flood might be how the war was remembered, as catastrophic separation, as drowning of the old world, as the overwhelming rush of change that swept away everything familiar and left survivors to begin again with only fragments of what had been. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the oldest surviving work of literature, contains within it a story that might be the clearest preservation of what was remembered. Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, loses his companion Enkidu and becomes obsessed with finding immortality, with escaping the death that has claimed his friend. His quest leads him to Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who tells him that the secret of eternal life is lost, that the gods had granted it once, in that ancient time before the waters rose, but that the gift cannot be repeated. This conversation between mortal king and flood survivor might encode the memory of what was lost in the division. Utnapishtim exists as a bridge figure, human but touched by divine favor, mortal but granted immortality, living in the world but separate from it, remembering an age that is past but unable to restore it. He can tell Gilgamesh what was, but cannot give him what he seeks. The door has closed, and Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed but transformed. He does not gain immortality, but he gains something else: acceptance, perhaps, or a different kind of wisdom. He returns to his city and looks upon its walls, its structures, its permanence in stone, and finds meaning there. Not the meaning he sought, not the eternal life of the gods, but the human meaning of building something that outlasts the individual builder. This might be the lesson that remained after the war, after the departure, after the long age of grief and confusion. That humanity would have to find its own meaning, build its own monuments, create its own continuity across generations, without the guidance of those who remembered longer and saw farther. The acceptance of limitation as the beginning of genuine human civilization. But the stones suggest this acceptance did not come easily or quickly. The temples kept being built, kept being rebuilt, each one an attempt to call back what had departed or to maintain connection with what had withdrawn. The rituals continued for millennia, long after their original context had been lost. The cylinder seals kept being carved with images of the tall figures, even as those figures became more abstract, more symbolic, less like depictions of beings once present and more like icons of an idea. The idea that humans were not alone, had not always been alone, might not always be alone. There are seals from very late periods, from when Babylon had risen and fallen, from when the Persian Empire had conquered Mesopotamia and introduced new gods and new ways of thinking, that still show the old images, still show the tall figures and the short figures, the symbols of sky and earth, the patterns that had been repeated for thousands of years. Someone was still carving these images, still believing they mattered, still trying to preserve the memory even as the world changed beyond recognition around them. This persistence speaks to the power of what was being remembered. Not just historical events, but something that had shaped human consciousness at a fundamental level. The knowledge that there had been a time of connection, a time when humanity had not been the only intelligence acting in the world, when there had been others, teachers, guides, or simply presences whose existence had provided context and meaning to human life. And then that time had ended. The war, the division, the departure, however it was understood, whatever form it took, had closed that age and opened another. An age defined not by presence but by absence, not by guidance but by independence, not by certainty but by the necessity of making choices without access to higher perspective. The trauma of this transition echoes through Mesopotamian literature. The sense of having been abandoned, of being tested beyond capacity, of facing challenges without the resources that had been relied upon, but also, gradually, the development of human capability, the slow accumulation of knowledge through trial and error, the formation of laws and institutions and cultural practices that did not depend on divine instruction but arose from human negotiation and human wisdom. Perhaps this was what the division had been intended to produce, not as punishment, but as necessity, not as abandonment, but as trust. The Anunnaki, if they existed, if they taught and guided and then withdrew, might have done so because continued presence would have prevented the development of genuine human autonomy. Their departure, painful as it was, might have been the final teaching the lesson that could only be learned through absence, through having to navigate existence without the certainty of their guidance. But this is speculation, interpretation, imposed on fragmentary evidence. The stones do not tell us intentions. They show us only what was tall figures present, then distant, then absent. Division among them, tension, separation, and humanity left with images carved in stone, with stories that grew stranger and more elaborate the farther they got from whatever events they originated from, with the task of making meaning in a world that no longer provided it ready-made. The war remembered in Sumerian stone might ultimately be the war between memory and forgetting, between the human need to hold on to connection with the past and the inevitable forward movement of time that erodes all connection. The Anunnaki fade, not because they were defeated or destroyed, but because that is what all things do. Given enough time, they fade into memory, then into legend, then into symbol, and finally into absence, until only the stones remain to suggest they were ever present at all. And we, standing thousands of years farther still from whatever truth was being preserved, can only look at those stones and wonder. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? What did they know that we have forgotten? What memories were they carrying forward from their own ancestors? Memories already ancient to them, already half understood, already slipping away even as they pressed stylus to clay and carved images into stone. The seals in museums now are silent. They cannot speak. They can only show figures and symbols, patterns and relationships rendered in miniature on objects that fit in the palm of your hand. Each one is a message sent forward through time, a bottle cast into the ocean of years, carrying its fragmentary story to shores the carver could never imagine. And the story they tell, collectively, patiently, is this. Something happened, something that mattered deeply. Something that changed the relationship between humanity and whatever it was that came before, that guided, that taught, that was remembered imperfectly as gods. There was unity and then division. There was presence and then absence. There was a war, though not the kind of war that fills battlefields with bodies or writes its history in conquest and defeat. It was a quieter war, a deeper war, the war of separation, of necessary ending, of doors closing between worlds or states of being that had once been connected. And it was remembered differently because there was no single way to remember it, no narrative that could capture the full complexity of what had occurred. Only fragments, only impressions, only the sense, carried forward through countless generations, that something had been lost that could never be fully recovered, only partially remembered in stone and story, and the persistent human feeling that we are not entirely alone, have not always been alone, but are separated from whatever else might exist by distances we cannot cross and cannot fully understand. The museums close at night. The stones sit in darkness behind glass, just as they sat in darkness beneath sand for millennia before archaeologists brought them into artificial light. And in that darkness, they wait patient, as only stone can be patient, carrying their images forward through time, without interpretation, without explanation, simply existing as evidence that something was witnessed, something was remembered, something mattered enough to be carved where it might last. We cannot know what the Sumerians knew. We cannot recover the context they possessed, the understanding they carried as background knowledge so obvious it needed no recording. We are separated from them not just by time, but by the accumulated losses of civilization after civilization rising and falling, languages dying, writing systems becoming obsolete, entire ways of thinking about reality fading into obscurity. But the stones remain, and they whisper if you know how to listen. Not answers, they have no answers, only questions rendered in image and symbol. Questions about what came before, about who walked among early humanity, about what was taught and then lost, about divisions that shaped the world we inherited. Without our knowing, the shape was imposed rather than natural. The war was remembered differently because memory itself is difference, each generation reshaping what it receives, each transmission altering the message slightly, until the original becomes unreachable, except through its echoes. And those echoes, preserved in stone, tell us only that there was something to echo, that the silence we hear now was not always silence, that the absence we feel was not always absence. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the stones do not need to tell us more than this, that we carry forward memories older than civilization, impressions deeper than history, the faint trace of a time when humanity was not alone in its journey, and then, for reasons lost to time, became alone and had to learn what that meant. The Anunnaki, if they were anything, were the last thing we forgot, and in forgetting them, we began to remember ourselves.